talking about code quality today and where we could grow our tooling as a community of developers. First of all, I'll explain why I happened to end up on this subject. My background with Elixir, whether I'm credible or not, is up to you. So the idea with PureType is something, the company's only about 9 weeks old or so, but the idea is to use developer activity to create a personalized learning journey and help share knowledge in teams. So initially focusing on Elixir as a functional language, where there's a lot of desire to learn it. It can be a little tricky to pick up for some, but the concept applies to lots of languages and technologies. Back at Tellurium, which is how I got exposed to Elixir in the first place, we process chat messages and voice calls for energy traders into a market data terminal. So when I used LiveView there first, it was for building an internal admin panel. And of course, it's a pretty fantastic technology to use. You get something going right off the bat, and there's a big iteration cycle obviously involved there as well. So I guess as an aside, if I was to write the terminal for Tellurium again in another front-end technology, it definitely would be LiveView. It's well suited to that kind of thing. But back 5 years ago when I started using Elixir, it was in its infancy, I suppose. So before that, I was the CTO at a hedge fund. It's a great way to get lots of practice, I suppose, but the technologies C++ and Perl are not exactly the best for iteration. If you contrast that with, say, Elixir, which has an excellent feedback cycle, it forces good architecture, and it does prize succinct code, but you have to put in the knowledge and figure out how the different concepts match together as well. So simple but powerful ingredients. So just going into a bit more of the cycle and something I'm looking into at PureType, for me, I can certainly see a feedback cycle between code quality and developer education. So when people joined Tellurium, which is where I used Elixir and Phoenix LiveView most, nobody who joined knew Elixir, but the people who ended up learning it and growing in the company, they ended up writing libraries like reverse proxy plug and hammocks. So obviously contributors to the community and something that's quite useful. So I enjoyed teaching others during that process, as well as teaching myself what I knew, and brought quite a few people up on the team up to speed, but I found the tooling for my teaching style lacking. So really the core of it is feedback is great. If you can give feedback in context almost immediately with follow-up, then that's even better. So primarily tools like code review from experienced colleagues, i.e. people who know the best way of formulating something, really do help. Static analyzers have a part to play too. So really what should happen over time is that you write more and more idiomatic code, but a good static analyzer will be able to tell you why something is less than ideal and give you a sense of the constructs of the language. You build up fluency like you do in any language. So one thing that also compounds that is Elixir, Phoenix, and the rest of the family is a fast-moving technology. Things do change, and some resources a newbie might might come across might be out of date as well. So in terms of static analysis and feedback and teaching, Credo, of course, is the top tool for that and most embodies these principles of feedback. Although René wasn't able to attend this conference, I have sent him the slides and he gave his approval, so that means something. And the idea with the basis of Credo is putting together a lot of different rules. More than 100 rules exist, with the broad categories being design, readability, refactoring, warnings, and consistency. And there's plenty of custom checks out there that might not fit into quite as neat a categorization. I've seen custom plugins, but they seem most useful for customizing output, from what I can see. This is just a little code graph, or thousands of lines contributed over time. In the project, red there is René himself. That's obviously mostly his work, but I think we could all help out just a bit as well, I'm sure. Hercules is the tool that generates this, by the way. So I've spotted a few gaps, and I note some of the questions beforehand. Concentrate mostly on option one. I suppose we all like to have more time for other things rather than fixing the same things over and over again. So I spent the better part of a week preparing for this and analyzing Credo and comparing it against other static analysis in other languages as well. And I think these are the most obvious, most impactful gaps to continue the project's momentum. And really, a lot of these are features that exist in other languages and that we can incorporate into Credo and other static analyzers as well. So the big one here is fix. What should be able to happen is you have these mistakes, but you can check them and just run something that automatically patches the abstract syntax tree or the source code itself. We don't need to keep on fixing the same things over and over again. The library that's useful for that is Sorcerer, which does AST modifications, the syntax tree based on the code, the expressions that are written themselves. It really has two ways to fix things. It's either editing the abstract syntax tree and then placing it back into a formatted piece of source code, or if you don't use mixed format or other things like that, there's the means to patch the strings themselves based on the structure of what you've already seen there too. So there's obviously a number of utility functions in Sorcerer that help with that. What is curious, and I'm not sure if everybody has come across this project, is Elixir Styler, which aims to do this really by being a combination of both mixed format and mixed Credo. And the difference here is it just fixes what it detects, which I suppose is like the -- fix in other languages, other static analyzers as well. But presumably you'll see the warnings in CI first, at least that's my experience, without catching them straight away. The project seems to be pretty active, has really received a lot of releases recently too. Maybe there is some path to integration to avoid duplication of effort there. So it's definitely worth checking out, and I'm sure there is something that's useful there. So moving on, the second gap I identified was a lack of library context, and I think one thing that I tend to kind of pull up is the fact that you can have a exception or error raising function and then the non-error raising one that returns an OK or error tuple. So if we're clever about it, you can pick out which ones could actually simplify expressions, because you're kind of matching on the fact that this always needs to succeed anyway. This feels like a trivial example, but that's exactly what we shouldn't be thinking about as humans, about how to transform something that's slightly longer than it needs to be into an equivalent but shorter form. So this will always be the property of a language like Elixir, because you always have many options in terms of composability and convention. And because things are immutable statement to statement, we should be able to reason about a set of statements like this example and transform a lot of code automatically. The only thing that's missing here, and maybe it needs, just another rule perhaps, is the ability to look at each function in turn and work out if that sort of bang equivalent exists as well. Doesn't seem too tricky. This was something that I think others who are picking up Elixir might struggle with, is sometimes the individual bits are extremely well documented, but it's kind of hard to reason about how they should interact together. So this is something I tended to pick up on review, which is, you're not quite using the exact map lookup that would be optimal, or at least express what you want to do most clearly as well. So that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ways of looking up stuff in a map. That's not to say Elixir is a complex language, but it's just getting on board with that as a beginner is something a good static analyzer or linter might be able to help with as well. So expanding on that, you can see that with the idiomatic form, the way most people after a while would write Elixir, it'd definitely be the right-hand side, but it's way too easy if you're beginning and you don't have too much feedback to focus on, or to really write something on the left-hand side. Or, alternatively, over time, the function that might start off being the right-hand side might just evolve into the left-hand side anyway. It does happen, and obviously that's where having a floor on code quality does help as well. But right-hand side, including pattern matching and guards, feels very much more Elixir-ish, but the transformation between the left-hand side and right-hand side is pretty mechanical anyway. Another gap I came across is, well, there's a lot of checks in Credo. There's really some conceivable families of checks. I think what's fair to say here is those 6 or so that are mentioned there, you're either going to be happy with Credo offering an opinion on your pipeline or not. There's not really a need. Perhaps I could be mistaken to configure these 6 checks independently, given their very similar nature. What it's really saying at a high level is compress my pipeline. Don't have as many steps as are currently written, because they're either equivalent or they could be combined into operations as well. This list isn't even complete. What you can do with enum map plus enum reduce is use enum map produce, enum flat map, enum reduce, flat map reduce as well. That's not always something that necessarily comes to all of us all the time as well. And yeah, using the standard library at a high level involves a fair bit of context like this. You have to be able to recall it immediately, and that's not always, there's many other things to think of, especially during a code review session as well. Community fragmentation perhaps is an issue. I mean, I've seen this in other languages where there's definite families. ESLint is a great example of where community is clustered around rule sets for particular parts of the language, or other libraries or third-party libraries, for example. Here it is a bit mix and match, and I contributed to that at Tellurian by writing our own random set of rules and pushing that to GitHub as well, so I'm just as guilty as everybody else. What I would say here is I spotted at least one rule I'd written myself while doing this research, and I should have used that implementation instead. And quite a few of the repositories I found, not the ones mentioned here, only contain a single custom rule. So it's certainly fragmentation is an issue there. Okay, having identified these gaps, what can we start, how do we close them, I suppose? So by the community, I certainly include myself. So I'm certainly going to start contributing, and obviously I've got to focus on static analysis and code quality. It would be good too. Grouping the rule sets by library is probably a very useful direction, and with Absinthe, Ecto, and Phoenix, they all have a domain-specific language that could be checked as well. So the other thing is to play around with mixed format plugin for Credo, get something off the ground, and it doesn't matter if there's only one rule that needs an automatic fix, or sorry, that does have an automatic fix present. That's one rule that it can be automatically fixed from now until the end of time as well. So this is, more building upon the good usage of functions that already exist. I'm sure, I mean, obviously it depends on how familiar your team are over time, but it's really quite easy to write stuff on the left-hand side there. But if you know the standard library well, you can transform that straight away. It's just a lot more typing, but it does take up time as well. And we can always provide an explanation for the rule. It's a great teachable moment when you can pick up something that's less than idiomatic and say, here's the way to write it because the language works this way, and here's another thing that's also related as well. It's a good way to stimulate curiosity and conversation and questions as well. After a while, it's not because it's included in Credo that you absolutely have to include it in your config, and maybe experienced teams over time won't see a need for this rule. But I think teams that care about code quality will always want to have the clearest code possible. Third of my suggestions is playing off the community side of things and the organization. We can always bring together more Credo rules and Credo configuration, and there'll always be a long tail of Credo rules that are only useful to one company. Fair enough. But once the community starts duplicating rules, like I did, then we can push that up to a more visible repo. And so this is similar to how JavaScript, TypeScript, linter config works, where companies like Airbnb push their style guides as packages that you can extend from in your ESLint configuration. And I want to have the same standard as these guys. Is often a great base to work from. You don't need to reinvent the wheel every time or form an opinion about absolutely everything. That happens over time. So you point out here that, well, the EXS files are Elixir scripts. They are currently extensible, but that probably needs to be a more obvious convention or a well-documented library function in Credo, which would be in the context itself, that you can invoke in these scripts. So that sort of concludes the things that I think should happen, and I'll certainly make sure some of them happen. And the further thoughts I have are ones where I'm still sitting on the fence, or it wasn't as clear to me how this could evolve. So in my experience, linters and static analyzers are very useful for avoiding common mistakes. And over time, they can raise the quality of the code base by raising a floor on code quality. It's kind of nice to say, OK, this issue happened because of the way we wrote X, or we didn't use this particular language feature, or if we forgot to check for this, adding a rule that does that and then raising the floor over time. It doesn't work for everything. There doesn't need to be a analysis of absolutely everything, but there are certainly some high-impact ways in which we can write new rules and maybe share them with the rest of the community as well. What I would say here is, but there are definitely areas of code quality that are more subjective, and they are suggestions that we should feel free to ignore. And that's not quite where Credo and most static analysis is. People still want to run it as part of a CI pipeline, and know that the issues that are being recognized are ones that they can actually go and address straight away, and that's getting it down to zero, of course, is the goal of any company that cares about code quality there. So does that mean that we need Credo for this? And if we had an alternative, or we needed to extend Credo, what kind of properties would make it suitable for this as well? This is probably somewhat more controversial. So if you've come across Tree Sitter, it's a library, or if you haven't, it's a library for breaking down code written in different languages into the same tree-based representation. And so it's used for syntax highlighting in IDEs and other applications such as that. So what you can then write are these matcher expressions which match particular structures of trees and then put them into captures as well. And it's fair enough to say that, well, we have that in Elixir already. You can pattern match on the representation of an AST, and that's exactly how we write Credo rules to begin with. What I would say there is you can do that with strings, but we also use another domain-specific language, regular expressions, which are much simpler to write. Yes, it's another thing to learn, but it's also much more succinct as well. Maybe these S expressions will take off in some sense. Who knows? Or maybe it's another good way to write them. So this was more of a extension of the previous slide, which was to say, is pattern matching to this level just as clear to read or less clear to read compared to the previous slide as well? You decide. Would we lose power by offering this as an alternative syntax? Perhaps not. there. So, yeah, that's kind of it. In no way, of course, was that an exhaustive list, but I hope you found these suggestions and questions thought-provoking.
So do we have any questions in the room? Questions?
So the biggest problem that I've found is that when you upgrade between versions of Credo, you don't know what new rules are available. So I think that for me, one of the biggest things that would help is getting a list of new rules.
Yeah. I think that's a fair comment, and in some ways you want this diff between even something that says I'm not ready to add it to my configuration yet, but some mix command that says tell me everything that's changed, every new rule since this rule, and I can figure out what to apply after that. Would seem to work quite as well. So yeah, that's another good suggestion.
Any more questions in the room? We have a question in the Hoover app. A few questions actually. So first one is auto-fixing issues would be super nice, like sorting aliases.
Absolutely.
Any thoughts on that?
It was good that I put as that suggestion number one, so I kind of preempted that as well.
Yeah. Could be great to call library authors to deliver Credo checks for them alongside with the library.
What was the first part, sorry? Yeah, I would say that we could stand to write more checks as a community, I think, and my suggestion around writing project-specific ones is probably a good way to go there as well, at least to encourage. I think once you have that framework in place, even if it's only a few library-specific rules, that's still something that reduces the effort of actually adding to that list, rather than feeling like you have to create it yourself.
Also, one more question, like, what do you think is the biggest gap between Elixir and other languages?
Probably the auto-fixing, at least that's what I noticed more than everything else, but I think maybe the maturity of static analysis in Elixir in general. I think there's still a place for it. I don't think it needs to be a sort of idiot-proofing as such, but it also stimulates a bit more learning in the language as well.
Cool. Any more questions? No questions. So let's give another warm round of applause to Matthew.